Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second in the Royal Drawing School's spring series of creative conversations. I'm really delighted to welcome this evening John Bird and Timothy Hyman in conversation about the art of the American painter Leon Golub. Drawing was the foundation of the painting of Leon Golub, his method of mediation between his extensive photographic archive and the canvas. Working from as many as 20 images for each figure, Golub's expressive realism captured awkward, fragmentary moments of violent confrontation and psychological interaction that characterized his visual narratives. Tim Hyman and John Bird will discuss these aspects of his art and the intimate and complex relations between his practice and that of his lifelong studio companion and wife, the artist Nancy Spero. So it's wonderful to have Tim and John joining us to discuss Golub's art. John Bird is an artist, writer and curator with particular expertise on Golub, having published widely on the artist, including 2 monographs, Leon Golub, Echoes of the Real, and Leon Golub, Power Play, The Political Portraits, as well as publishing on Nancy Spero. And he's also curated 3 Golub retrospectives in Dublin and New York, at the Reina Sphere in Madrid, and the Met Brewer in New York. And Leon Golub, Power Play, The Political Portraits at the National Portrait Gallery in London, and that was in 2016. John is currently Emeritus Professor of Art and Critical Theory at Middlesex University, and I was happy to learn that he's also alumnus of the Royal Drawing School. And now to introduce Tim Hyman, who will of course be known to many of you as a founding teacher at the Royal Drawing School, as well as a renowned painter and author. He trained at the Slade and was elected a Royal Academician in 2011, and has exhibited widely, including 10 solo shows in London. He's the author of Bonar, of Sienese painting, one of my favorites, I have to say, always take it to Italy whenever I'm there, and The World New Made. And his long engagement with contemporary Indian painters includes the monograph Bhupen Kakar. Tim has also curated several major exhibitions, including narrative paintings at the ICA and touring, Carnivalesque at Hayward and touring, and the Stanley Spencer retrospective at Tate Britain. So welcome to you both. And just before we start, just to remind everyone listening that you're very welcome to engage with us in the conversation by leaving comments and questions in the chat box or the Q&A, or you can wait till the end as usual and pose your questions directly to John and Tim. Thank you.
Just before we begin, can I just, sorry. Oh, well, all right, let's just begin then. We'll come back.
I'm trying to mold the body to get a convex form to it and get some of the pressure of the body against a relatively tight-fitting shirt on this guy. So that like, pretty tricky. Let's see what else. Slow, boring process painting is compared to photography. Yeah, they're very good. And the woman who runs it, of course, another art fanatical type. You know what I mean? Yes. Puts their whole life into it. Oh, yes. That's the only way to do it, though. You're right. You know.
So these are all images of women. The image at the bottom is Leonardo's The Virgin, St. Anne, and the Infant and a Lamb.
Just to say, that's Nancy Spero.
To a contemporary work of Aboriginal images, juxtaposing them so that they reverberate or have tension. A showing of the simultaneity. Just a whole mess of mix-ups, you know, and combinations.
Terrific.
So this is the kind of thing I'm doing now. But it's funny, I've used Leonardo twice. In 72 and 85.
I saw an exhibition here in New York of his work, and I got very excited. I'd never seen anything like that, and decided that I should bring one to Montreal for purchase. It was the first sale of one of these large paintings, or first museum to have bought one of these paintings. And there was a debate that lasted for, I think, 9 months. I mean, there was one person who got very violent and said people are going to throw stones at, into the windows of the museum. They're going to attack. It will turn young people into delinquents. They were afraid of the violence, of course, the violence in themselves. The thing is that people will accept a Goya because it's 200 and some years ago, and then it's very far away. But when it's mercenaries and interrogations that people know are going on practically next door, they get scared. The more the debate went on, the more mysterious Mr. Golub was. It's a bit like Leonardo. And so he came to Montreal to talk to the acquisition committee. And I think it was a revelation that you were just a what a sweet guy. That's I right. Really was.
Okay. I mean, one of the reasons I think for showing that initially is that the marriage of Nancy Spero and Golub was an extraordinary partnership where they remained together in the studio with just a partition, which was also their living space all their life. And John Bird has a fascinating story to tell, which he told in a very good essay in the Serpentine exhibition, quite one of the most recent, I think it was the most recent big Golub show we've seen. Yeah. Just in a way, life-changing relationship that developed where he stayed with them, which meant they were working at night, he was trying to sleep. They didn't have any cooking facilities. They went out for every meal or had takeaway. Now, I'm mentioning all this because I think often the biographical element is underplayed in talk about artists. And I still feel it's very important to realize some artists, at least, do represent a whole way of being, a whole lifestyle. And I think that this is one of the themes we're going to hope to touch on a bit. It's not easy to do in this context, but something of that. One thing that became clear in the film we just saw an extract from is that Nancy would come into his studio, he would come into her studio and comment on the work as it was going on. So Nancy might say, that arm is much too long, and he would take note. He would do something about it. Okay. So,
yeah, they were each other's first viewer, first critic, first respondent. And yes, Tim said, when I arrived as a rather naive, youngish person in New York for the first time, which was in 1984, and went to their studio, which is just below Washington Square in New York. It's the whole floor of one of those buildings. All those buildings used to be the rag trade. And they'd acquired it. First of all, it was Leon's studio, and then it became their living quarters in the mid-1970s is when the whole family lived there. But I wasn't prepared for this. I mean, you know, I was sort of, I'd been to artist studios, I trained at art college, but the scale of a New York studio was something I wasn't prepared for. And I also wasn't prepared for this complete mixing of the domestic with the productive. I mean, there's no distinction really between working space and living space. They completely blended into each other. And I think I think it's probably more common now, and there's other American artists that I've worked with that it's like that. But it meant that your relationship with the artists didn't sort of, you know, it wasn't just a professional relationship of going there, working, talking to them, making notes, seeing the work, because it was constantly being interrupted by people visiting, by the phone ringing, by domestic things. Let's stop for a meal. Nancy always saying, would you like a cup of tea or a cookie? And that took a bit of getting used to. And as Tim mentioned, they had this strange, for me anyway, working practice, which originated when they were in Paris. They went to Paris in 1959. They were in Paris from 59 to 64. They went with 2 young sons, and the 3rd son, Paul, was actually born while they were in Paris. And Nancy took to working, first of all, in the evenings and then through the night as the only time in which there was some quiet in the apartment. And Leon did, kept her company. So that became their pattern of work. When they returned in 64, rather than go back to Chicago, where they originated from, they were determined to, in their own words, make it in New York. So they relocated to New York. And of course, this working practice of nighttime working and daytime napping became their way of working for all the years that I knew them. It was a strange practice. When I first arrived there, expecting kind of the normal sort of, sit down in the evening, have a drink, have a meal, maybe watch a bit of telly. No, none of it. It was literally, it was work. Work dominated everything.
Yeah, I mean, there's a quotation from, I should say, Golub is a wonderful writer on art, in my view, a commentator. I mean, it's when you take him on, you take on partly a verbal person as well as an artist, I think.
Yes.
But he does say at one point, he says, I recognize in Nancy's work a subtle, complex and powerful subversion of everything that I'm about. So it wasn't, in other words, wasn't a bland yes relationship. It was she regarded his work as overscaled, masculinist, or having all the wrong things that made women neglect painting for so many decades. You see, so all that story is part of their relationship too.
Yes, very much so.
And her smallness of scale, is interesting.
Yes. Although, of course, Nancy's scale also stretched. I mean, she did her scrolls, works that were, 200, or the largest was over 300 feet long. So,
but they were narrow in.
They were narrow. They were narrow. But she kind of claimed scale herself. But it was a very productive relationship. I mean, I've known other kind of, partner working relationships in the art, and there's, of course, there are tensions and the contrasts, and their careers, particularly in terms of gallery interest, museum interest, and critical interest, waxed and waned. And certainly for the early period, right up and through probably till the late 80s, it was Leon who was the focus. He was the one who had galleries and had representation, everything. Nancy had her connections in New York. She was a founder member of the first women's collective AIR gallery, which is where she first showed. But there was no real sense of, I mean, she resented the fact that he was getting the attention she wasn't, but it wasn't a kind of resentment of envy. It was a resentment of, I should have this attention as well. And of course that happened. In fact, towards the end of their lives, it was Spero who was having more critical attention, more exhibitions than Leon. So it did change over the years.
Shall we talk about this particular painting?
Yes, yeah. The painting, the one that we're looking at, you see, it's Interrogation 2, 1981, acrylic on linen. Leon always worked on large paintings. I mean, history painting, he saw himself as a history painter. And that was from a very early period. I mean, certainly when they were in Paris, 59 to 64, he spent a lot of time at the Louvre. He saw, the great French history painters, responded to those, and but he always worked on a large scale. And in fact, I think he was one of those artists who didn't have to build up to a large scale. He felt comfortable on a large scale right from the start. In fact, the scale that he was much less comfortable on was, a kind of sort of 4 foot, 3 foot, 5 foot kind of canvas. He didn't feel pictorially that he could position his figures within that, unless they were just portrait heads or something like that. So you really needed to work on a wall-size canvas. You
and,
saw
and they're roughly twice life size, aren't they, the figures? We saw
yeah.
it in the film. We realized just how big they are.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that I think was unusual, somebody who worked on this kind of scale, was that the work evolved over the process of constructing the pictorial space. So he didn't have preliminary drawings and sketches. He didn't think so with this painting. He didn't think in advance, well, it's going to have 5 figures. You know, I mean, he knew roughly that it was going to be the theme of it. It was part of the interrogation series. But he would work, again, we saw this a bit on the film, from his enormous archive of found images. I mean, he was a real image, in fact, both artists were image scavengers. And Leon, for a new painting, would raid his image bank, take out images that he thought might be useful, and would just take them to the canvas. And that's how a figure would gradually evolve, by reference to these images. So the drawing, the composition, the structure evolved through the working process. It wasn't, I say, all worked out in advance.
I mean, one of the paradoxical things in his formation, on the one hand, he's using, if you like, an abstract expressionist scale and a history painting scale. And there is a lot of classical reference in his work. He was very interested in classical art. And I think the red comes from Pompeian painting at some level. But I think he spoke about pushing the figure right out of your space, right forward. It's an aggressive thing to do.
I mean, this is very much this kind of red oxide is very much a kind of Golub red. They had a year in Italy in 1956-57, which in fact was funded by a early collector of Golub, a guy called Hubert Greenwald, who was a Chicago business person and property developer, and was also an early supporter of Golub and collector of his work. And he funded the family for a year, well, in fact, 9 months in Italy. And that was when they started off on Ischia, and then they went to Florence. And from Florence, they visited Pompeii, they went to Herculaneum. So this red oxide related, I think, to the wall paintings in some of the villas in Pompeii, and almost became a kind of signature style of Golub throughout this period in the 1980s. And yes, it's part of it is to force the figure forward into the spectator's space, the same way as chopping off the figures, you know, at the knees or at the ankles. It was another device to actually force them very much up against the viewer.
But at the same time, there's something very raw and unpleasant and so on. And we both, I think, agree that one crucial person at the root of that, as of so much Chicago painting, was Dubuffet. And I mention it because we're going to have a Dubuffet show opening next week, is it?
Yes.
2 weeks' time at the Barbican.
Yeah.
And it's rather overdue because he does have Dubuffet, his interest in outsiders, in insane art, is also part of, I think, Golub's formation.
Very much. I mean, when Golub and Spero were students at the Art Institute, well, in fact, I think Nancy graduated in 1949. That's where they met at the Art Institute of Chicago, and Leon in 1950. In 1951, there was a Dubuffet exhibition in Chicago, and he gave a talk at the Arts Club, which was handed around the script of the talk, and then became one of a kind of key statements of Dubuffet's work. So Dubuffet was central, I think, and Art Brut, and to some, and also the Prinzhorn collection of outsider art. They had the publication that went along with that. So these are two very important influences that fed into their work. Should we go to the next image? Right, we're now looking at Gigantomachy 1. So we're actually stepping back. We started with the much more, I suppose, better known work of the 80s. Gigantomachy 1, still very much under the influence of the antique, the classical period. This was something that was Golub's and to some extent Spero's point of reference from the 1950s through into, I guess, the mid 1960s. And the particular references for Golub were classical friezes, and the great altar of Zeus at Pergamon right, which is here.
Which is in Berlin.
Sorry?
Which is in Berlin.
In Berlin, yes, yeah, in Berlin, was a point of reference for much of the work of this period. So this kind of, these battling figures, and again, with when he's drawn to the classical, it's not the kind of ideal male figure of the Athenian, sort of period. It's the later Hellenistic and the Roman state. It's the point at which these figures, if anyone has seen the Pergamon altar or images of it, I mean, they are barely contained within the architectural frame. They're falling out of it. It's an almost uncomfortable kind of relationship. So this is something that Golub takes, and he did this series of gigantomachy paintings, which are 19-20 feet canvases, based upon the classical frieze as images of almost kind of universal endless conflict.
And as you say, he always emphasized that he was awkward, and that he said I'd like to make my images as unpalatable as possible.
I think awkwardness is something that he was, I think a lot of artists, I mean, the way in which artists, you work not in a way with your strengths, but you work with your weaknesses. I mean, Leon always felt he was clumsy. I mean, he had very flat feet, and so he had quite a sort of clumsy way of moving and walking. He used to say that had fed into his art. Actually, I think he drew superbly, so I don't think that clumsiness sort of went on into that. But it's the idea of clumsiness or awkwardness, certainly, as being a resistance to too much facility, to too much ease. And he's always working against that. And I think that continues through in, can we have the next slide? Into these sort of structure of the figures. They're very, very awkward figures. Large scale, again, these about 1.5 times life size. Napalm 1, 1969. So from the gigantomatches, he's now, they've come back to New York. They came back in 64. And the other thing, of course, that is now taking up American politics is the Vietnam War. And Golub's images of universal conflict start to become more specific. So the reference to Napalm 1 is, of course, to the napalm that was used extensively in Vietnam. So it's no longer just an image of universal conflict, although the figures are still non-specific, they're to some extent abstracted, but it has a particular historical reference, which becomes, of course, throughout in the 60s, the 70s and onwards, his major point of reference to tie down a particular event, to ask the question of how an artist can respond to the events of history and engage with them.
Yeah, I mean, that orange, once you begin to see it as napalm, it changes the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. We have the next image. So it wasn't just, of course, Leon who was responding to the war. In fact, it was impossible not to respond to it, but Nancy as well. She had been painting when they were in Paris. She did this series of paintings, still oil paintings, which were called the Black Paris paintings. And she continued painting for about a year after they returned to New York, but became increasingly dissatisfied with painting with oil, particularly as a medium. Again, it was a kind of sense that this is men's art. This is not something I want to do. And also the fact that they had 3 sons. She did this series of works over about a 2-year period in 1968 to 69 that she called the War Series. They were small, as you see, 68 by 86 centimeters. I mean, that's an average size of them. On paper, gouache, ink, sometimes 1 or 2 or even 3 a day. And if you see the works, it's almost as if she is incising into the painting, into the paper. There are times where the pen actually rips part of the paper. So they're very angry works, but very controlled works. So you've got Golub doing the napalm paintings, and you've got Spero doing the War Series. And of course, they were also both very much involved in political activities as well.
No.
So this is from the Artaud series. I mean, after the war series for Spero. And I mean, partly the reason I think why we decided that we should talk about Nancy as well as Leon is because over the years, as I've worked on both artists, I've come to realize it is actually quite, well, not just difficult, but almost a disservice to try and discuss one artist without discussing the other. It wasn't just their close working relationship, but the ways in which their imagery fed off each other, and almost kind of, was internalized. I think not in necessarily a conscious way, but certainly they were responding very much to each other's work. And after the war series, Spero started this period of work on the poet Antonin Artaud, and she chose Artaud.
Poet and theatre person.
And theatre, yes, the theatre of the absurd. She chose Artaud. Well, she because they had those period of time in France, the two of the sons, well, in fact, all sons were more or less bilingual. They were very familiar with French, and it was, I think, Phil, the middle son, who introduced Nancy to the work of Artaud, because she was looking for, to some extent, a way of expressing her own sense of exclusion from the art world, of a way of trying to find a voice. And the experience of Artaud, who spent 11 years in the asylum at Rodez, and a lot of his poetry, his work, and of course his drawings, is this almost a sort of, obscene scream against being silenced. So she adopted the text, the poetry of Artaud, but she placed it alongside this extraordinary imagery, which is drawn partly from medieval illustrations, from any medieval psalters, from a whole range of references across histories and cultures. So you get the text, which is produced, which is the poetry of Artaud, collaged with these extraordinary images, particularly this snake head with the protruding tongue, which she used recurrently. So while Leon is painting, she is starting to work on the Artaud series.
I hadn't really thought about this, but it's very interesting that early basilisk also comes out of Artaud completely independently. They would have no, but the sort of raving, ranting anger of Artaud does seem to have had a special appeal. I suppose it's the end of existentialism in a way.
Yes, yes, exactly, yeah. Can we have the next image? So we're now kind of, after the Napalm series, Golub wanted to become even more specific in terms of his visual references. I said he started to compile this archive of images from, well, probably from sort of the late 50s, early 60s. And there's a magazine, a journal called Soldier of Fortune, which a lot of these images came from, which is, as it implies, it was images of mercenaries, forces around the world. And he did these three enormous Vietnam paintings between 1972 and 1974. They're roughly 40-foot canvases. Vietnam 2 is in the collection of the Tate Gallery. I don't think it's on display, well, when it reopens at the moment, but it has been, shown quite extensively there. And it's the shift really from, to some extent, I see it as a kind of closure of the period of work from the 1950s through to the mid 1970s, as he's moving still. I mean, the themes, of course, are the same. It is conflict, it is battle, it is violence, it is power, and how these impact upon upon bodies. But it is become increasingly specific to the point at which he is making very particular reference to the GI imagery, to armory, to weaponry, and the the kind of architectural forms relate to some of the hut architecture and things in Southeast Asia. So these three paintings, the three Vietnam paintings, move him from war and conflict as a universal and globalizing presence to something that is very specific, and of course is very much part of American history.
Yeah. Shall we have the extract now?
Yeah.
Second extract.
Okay, Mercs, fallen figures, and guns. This is my key photo because of the way he's got his face pushed into the ground. And I thought of using these guys then with him. I mean, there's a real tension to the way they're angled, especially this one. I want to have him put his hand on his head, pushing his head down. If you look at Renaissance art, medieval art, Assyrian art, we think of art as recording the acts of a civilization. It also tells you a lot about who has power and who is getting the stick. It's a report. It's a report on how things are today. I've always been awkward. So my paintings always have an awkward presence. And that awkward presence, I try to exaggerate. I try to make it split off, to be disjunctive, which shows here, okay? It's a clumsy drawing. A lot of people could draw it more smoothly than that. Look at the way he occupies the space. You almost see him like some Tyrannosaurus or something rearing up in terms of the action. It's really kind of crazy. All right. I once described myself as a machine for producing monsters. And I keep producing them. But my production of monsters is really minuscule compared to the real production of monsters. They're ugly, and their actions are very ugly, and the technique is very rough and brutalized. But there have been a lot of artists through the ages, they've started from ugly, and that's the best way to get to beauty. Start from the ugly, and the uglier you make it, you attain, you squeeze out of it that kind of beauty. So another messy painting, another ugly item, despite all those words about beauty. Another ugly item goes into the world. It's art. It's a feat. Okay?
Okay.
He had a wicked sense of humor as well. I think you get a little bit of that coming across in that clip, but he could be very funny about his own work as well as.
I mean, I think that's part of the ambiguity that he's talking about. That it isn't, as it were, it isn't like Jericho really. There is irony, and there is even not self-loathing, but certainly a comedic dimension, which is very much there, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not quite as sort of crude, hitting you over the head as it first appears. I think, a lot of people take a dislike to it. They think they're just being bullied, but I don't think that's exactly the right take on him. He is, as you say, very funny.
Yes, and I think he's avoiding any kind of stereotypical contrast between good and evil. I mean, if Golub is the painter of evil in post-war America, which to some extent he is, the demonic, the evil, it's very much, I think, the evil that Hannah Arendt writes about after her period of the Eichmann trial and the book on Eichmann, and she has this term of banality of evil. Golub doesn't want to, although he says he paints monsters, in fact, actually they aren't monsters at all. I mean, they are everyday people.
He's going at those paintings with a meat cleaver, and there is something almost sadistic in the, he's sort of implicating himself at some level in the violence.
Yeah, Yeah, and that's something he did from early on. I mean, he started working with this with the cleaver, of putting solvent onto the canvas and then scraping it and repainting it with the gigantomatches.
Yeah.
And what that gives is this kind of faded, abraded kind of surface to the work. Distressed surface. Yes, no, exactly. And it also, of course, embeds the image in the surface. So the image is not laying on the surface. It actually enters into the surface and becomes part of the warp and weft of the linen. Now, so he did the 3 Vietnam paintings, and he had a kind of hiatus. He had a period after Vietnam 3. And I mean, I say these are enormous paintings. They took a long time. He did 3 of them over a 2-year period. There was a kind of physical, but also I think a mental exhaustion. He wasn't quite sure how to move on from that, how to proceed from that. The war had ended, not well, but the war had ended. And in fact, it was a chance resemblance of one of the soldiers in Vietnam 3 to photographs, media photographs of the young Gerald Ford, that gave him the idea of moving, for a time being at least, away from the representation of power and violence in terms of a large historical narrative, to how you can actually represent the banality of evil in terms of a portrait. He wasn't interested in portraiture in its conventional sense at all. It wasn't a sense of trying to, get to the essence of the subject or anything like that. So he never worked from life, of course. They were all from images that he got from Reuters or from the press or from other journals, etc. It was about the media representation of people who are in the public eye, and people mostly male, not entirely, but mostly male, who had positions of power within corporate, military, or political society. And he also worked in series. That was the other thing. He did a series of General Franco. He did a series of Castro. He did a series of Rao, but he also did American businessmen. He did Rockefeller. He did American politicians. So over this period in 76, 77, he did something in excess of 100 political portraits, and they are roughly life size. So the head is maybe just a slightly larger, but not much. And we've only ever been able to track something like about 86 of these when I did the book on his political portraits. So there's still another 20 or 30 out there. And he did do at least half a dozen of women. He did one of Eva Peron, but what has happened to those? I've no idea. So that occupied that period from 76 to 77, 78. So can we have the next image?
What was the year you met him?
I met them in, well, I yes, I suppose it's a story of how I got to know Golub, which is, you can tell briefly. With colleagues, I co-published a journal at the university called Block, which we had been writing for. And a friend of mine, an American feminist art historian called Carol Duncan, was also a friend of Leon and Nancy's. And she showed something that I had written published in Block in, I think, 1980, which was on the First World War artists of the First World War, particularly on Nash and Nevinson. And he then wrote to me. And that's in fact the little letter that I include in the Serpentine catalogue in the essay. That was our first point of contact. Mm-hmm. She showed the copy of Block to him, and he wrote to me and said he would like to know what else I've written. And we started corresponding. And Sandy Nairn, who was then director of art at the ICA, was a friend. And I said, wouldn't it be great to do a Golub exhibition? And he had been thinking of doing that himself. And that resulted in Leon's first exhibition in London for a quarter of a century at the ICA, which was in 1982. And Leon asked me if I would write an essay for the catalogue, which I did. And then he and Nancy came over, of course, for, you know, for the opening. And that's when we actually met the first time. And I hadn't then been to New York, and he said, you've got to come to New York. So I think it was 2 years later in '84 is when I first made that first trip.
No, I want to sort of say something a bit setting the cat among the pigeons. But when I read your first writing on Leon Golub, it was extremely theoretized to my. I mean, and I felt that whenever I sort of dared to glimpse or glance at Bloch, it was pretty theoretized. And I mean, you know, there would be lots of reference to Althusser, Foucault, etc. But there would be hardly ever anything about a single specific painting spoken of. You know, there were 30 paragraphs before you got to a single painting. But you've totally changed, John. I mean, yeah. your monograph is completely rational. I mean, completely readable, very readable, and there are no linguistic problems. It's not theoretized in that way. So, what would you say that they were one of the factors that changed your language, your?
Well, I could say older and wiser, but yes, partly. I mean, when we did the journal block, and you know, it was a time when, if you were involved in writing about culture of any kind, you had to do it more or less within a kind of theoretical framework. And unlike the Sorry?
What do you mean you had to?
Well, I mean, no, it wasn't that you had to. I think we were in love with theory. We were trying to find a way to understand the objects of study that we are interested in. We were also, I think, reacting very much against the with a small c, conservative traditional disciplines of art history, design history.
Bell-letrist.
Connoisseurship, etc. Yes, exactly. And although now I would certainly go back and I'd read Panofsky and I'd read all of those other historians, of course, at that time, it was a matter of trying to incorporate the translations of theoretical work coming mostly out of France, of course, semiotics, in structuralism, in psychoanalysis, and to see if there was a way in which those theoretical concepts could be put to work in relationship to the visual. I mean, it kind of seems, it was such a different moment. I mean, I've taught courses on structuralism, post-structuralism, Foucault, et cetera, at university. And students, you know, you set the text and they read the text and you give them models of how to apply them, et cetera, et cetera. We're now so familiar with it. But at the time we weren't, and we were meeting as reading groups and wrestling with theory. You know, reading Althusser, reading Foucault, reading Freud, Lacan, Marx, et cetera, and trying to make sense of it.
And you see, I mean, watching the drawing school develop over 20 years, it was clear that a lot of our students were refugees from theory. And in a way, you became a refugee from theory. I mean, by becoming a member of the drawing year, you were, I don't say you were repudiating, but it was essentially you were exposing yourself very vulnerably to something else.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, it was, yes. I mean, I still, you know, I'm still drawn to various writers who are, you know,
yes.
Of course. I mean, I think also when I first wrote about Spero, which was for the Phaidon, well, it's for the ICA catalogue and then for the Phaidon monograph, it was very much a matter of wanting to find a theoretical framework to describe and address and talk about the work. And I think that's what I did when I first was writing about Golub. But then, yes, I mean, it was the experience of being with them and talking with them. And I recorded hours of tape with both Leon and Nancy in the studio, which I've, you know, sort of recycled and drawn upon and used over the last 20 years. And as I was starting to write about other artists, I found that that experience of conversation with artists in relationship to their practice was something that was somehow so much more immediate and more direct that I didn't want a theoretical construct. I wanted it to open things up, not to close them down, not to get in the way. So in that respect, yes, I mean, I think the writing's changed a great deal. And I mean, it's like painting, it's like artwork. The more you do it, hopefully, the better you get. But yes, I mean, if I look back at some of those things I was writing then, but Leon was also, I mean, he was a kind of theory junkie.
Yeah.
To some extent, Nancy was, although not in a systematic way. I mean, they both, the studio, I say, was the whole floor of this building just below Washington Square, and 90% of the studio, of the space, the apartment, was working studio space. There was a wall that divided Leon's half from Nancy's half. Leon's half would have a large canvas, usually pinned to the wall, taped to the wall he was working on. Nancy's half would have trestle tables covered with images, you know, plates that she printed from the image, the cutouts of the various forms that she used. But they both had these tiny little cell-like rooms. They're almost like ship's cabins, that they're bedrooms that had masses of books in them. Nancy's had every writer in relationship, both historically and in the present, in relationship to feminism, to the women's movement. Leon had books on just about anything. And he had this incredible curiosity. I mean, he would read theory, he would read history, he would read science, he would read science fiction, he would read, of course, politics, and he would mark things up for Nancy. So there was this large table that everybody, the assistants and anybody there, would sit at, and this was the kind of focus of conversation. And it would be covered with books, magazines, journals, which Leon had marked up and had left for Nancy in case it's something she might find of interest.
It's all very vivid. Thank you, John. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Don't just say a bit about this particular work. I mean, was she drawing on a tradition of, as it were, text image, or was it? Do you feel she's really innovating something completely new?
I think she's innovating, although of course it's in relationship to what was happening in the broader art world of the time. I mean, with both of them. I mean, when Leon did this series of what I call the abstracts, the pylons, the shields, etc., it was partly a response in the early 1970s to shaped canvases. I think Nancy, the introduction of text, is both a way of telling a story, of finding a voice, but of course it's also in response to conceptual art. But she uses language in a very different kind of way. I mean, this work, I mean, she would deliberately comment on things. This is from Notes in Time on Women, which is 24 panels. It's in the permanent collection at MoMA now, and it's this extraordinary accumulation of quotations from mostly male writers in relationship to women across histories, across culture. And yet she would, you know, find a way of either intervening with them or subverting them. So you see here this dancing, this spread-eagled figure leaping across a quote from Derrida, which says there is no truth about women, there is no essence of women. And she would constantly sort of engage with those theoretical debates, but in her own way. I think Notes in Time in Women is a really quite extraordinary work. Okay,
well, we better have another one. It's very interesting.
Yes, actually, I've realized the time. So we're now into the 80s. He did a series of works under the thematic title Horsing Around, which was partly kind of posing a question to himself, which is, what are these guys who are in the mercenary pictures and in the interrogations do on their time off? So he called it Horsing Around, but it also introduced a female figure into his works, There was only one of the interrogation paintings that had a female figure in, which was a woman being tortured by two men. But these start to, again, introduce the days off for a mercenary or a torturer. But the other thing I think that he starts to introduce, and is always, I think, central to Golub's work, is he also engaged with questions of class, he engaged with questions of race, and also, of course, through, you know, his interrogation of a sort of toxic masculinity with sexuality. And this series of horsing around, slightly larger, smaller rather than some of the mercenary paintings, were in the early 1980s. And if we go on to the next one, and then did a series of works related to the situation in South Africa. This two black women and a white man. The space now, I mean, there is a kind of shallow space here. There's the figures leaning against a wall. It's still, you know, still brought very much up against it. But I think they're becoming increasingly sort of subtle in their concentration on the gesture, on the look, on the way in which the woman's hands, the way in which she is looking at the man who is looking out of the frame. They are, I think, political paintings in the most complex and subtle way. And they're all done through this concentration upon gaze, upon look, upon expression, upon the disposition of the body.
Have they in fact been purchased more than the interrogations?
No, there aren't a lot of the kind of key paintings still outside of either private or public collections.
Yeah.
In terms of toxic masculinity, try burning this one, asshole, and the figure.
Yeah.
And the next one. So then we get a shift again. So just as we got a shift in the mid-70s from the classical references to Vietnam, Leon turned 70 in 1992, and suddenly, and again, I think this is very much a response to the work that Nancy was doing. For a start, text starts to enter into the work. This one, Beware of Dog. They become more schematic, more fragmented. There's not that.
He says this very interesting thing. He says, I start with a dog, and then what? I deliberately don't know. You see, and another, I think 2004, a little bit later, the paintings, these kinds of paintings, they're sort of political, sort of metaphysical, and sort of bullshit. No, there's some truth in all that, and that's what's marvelous about them in a way. They could get. I remember seeing them. I think they were at the South London Art Gallery, right?
Yeah.
And they were very liberating to see.
Yeah,
what could happen.
I think he felt liberated in doing them to some extent. Yeah. He no longer felt sort of constrained by, you know, the pictorial space that he had established in the work through to that period. They make reference to graffiti, they make reference to street style. I think his conversations with Nancy were very important at this stage, because he started to introduce text, and he also started to become more, in a way, almost playful with color.
Playful, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next one, yeah, like this one, for example. And he would compile, just as he had an archive of images, he had an archive of texts. And if I came across anything, a quote from anyone I thought he might be useful, I would send it to him. Mm-hmm. And they would gradually find their way into paintings. So at the same time, Nancy is working. So this last one, like, yeah, this is the largest work that Spero ever did. This is the Black and the Red. And this was in the Serpentine Gallery. It's actually in the collection of the Pompidou. It's it's there, but we showed it there. And this is, I think it's Oh, it says 22 panels. I thought it was more. This is only part of it then. I think the whole one is 33 panels, and it's actually stretches over 300 feet.
I mean, it's a bit perhaps late in the talk to bring on this question that he did very consciously, angrily refute what he felt was what I think he called it a deeply held contempt for figuration in much of his culture. He felt it had become so ingrained that most curators thought abstraction was the way forward, as it were, right into the 20th century almost. I mean,
yeah. Well,
21st century. And I'll just give a quote. Those beliefs in abstraction come from a not always articulated but deeply held belief system that representation has failed the world, and the world can only be saved in a spiritual, even a physical sense, through abstraction. A new order. For me, figuration is a way into the world.
Yes.
And I felt that was that's one of the best ways of putting it I've come across.
Yeah, yes. And in fact, their reason for their leaving the States and going to Paris in that period was because they felt there was no audience for the work that they were doing for either artist. Golub was included in a show curated by Peter Seltz at MoMA called New Images of Man in 1959, which was new figuration. So it had Golub in it, but it also had European painters, British painters.
Althus and so on.
Bacon was in it, yes, yeah. Jacques Cometti was in it. Dubuffet was in it. And it received a very, very negative critical response. It was the kind of, it was the height of abstract expressionism. And they felt there was no point in staying there, so that's why they went to Paris. I mean, I've had many arguments with Leon over paintings. He was a great person to go and see an exhibition with. Well, in some respects he wasn't great, because Leon could get through an exhibition in seconds, whereas normally it would take you minutes, if not hours. If he didn't get drawn to something, he was out of there. And I remember going in to see a Cy Twombly at Gagosian, which was one Twombly painting, very, very large Twombly painting. And I mean, Leon more or less was in and out in seconds. And we had quite a strong argument about this. Interestingly, I think there are actually quite strong connections in some of his work. And I've been reading about Guston, more about Guston recently. I think there's a lot of connection between Guston and Golub. One of my regrets, I mean, you always think about these things that I wish I'd asked this question or that question in retrospect. I never asked, and I certainly don't remember him ever talking about Guston. So I don't know if they met or knew each other, but I think they must have done.
Yeah, they would have the same friends.
They would have the same friends, but also even
he was 9 years older, which is quite a big difference, isn't it?
It's a big difference, but Guston was one of the jurors for Exhibition Momentum, which was the exhibition of Chicago artists that Golub had partly had set up, and Guston was a juror in 1957. So if they were back in Chicago then from Italy, and I think they were, it's possible that, Leon was involved in that. But reading about Guston and how Guston's, his shift from abstraction to figuration seems to me in many respects, and his politics and his political position is very, very similar to Golub in many ways.
Yes, I think that's true. And I mean, it's probably worth saying that Golub didn't have a New York dealer for 20 years.
For 20 years, no interest in the work at all.
No.
Yeah. It was just having his teaching post and the support of one collector, the Rick Meyer in Chicago, that more or less kept them both going, in fact.
Yeah.
Right, should we just, I think we're nearly at the end. Nearly at the end. This is Laughing Lions, which is the one that, Tim, you have in your book. And it's a fabulous painting. It's 1995. And I think this very clearly, shows the influence of Spero, particularly the central figure, this acrobatic female figure, which if we go to the next one, Yeah, this is from the Black and the Red, and I think he's taken this figure and just sort of simply adapted it slightly. And it is the fulcrum of Laughing Lions. It is the figure around which all the action sort of revolves. Next, please. So we're coming now to the late works, 1998, The Blue Tattoo. I love this one. As you see, the lion, as he said, it's an old lion, you know, it's had its day, but it's still, you know, it can still roar a bit.
You reproduce the photograph in your book, which is of a tiger, but he chooses a lion.
Yes.
Makes a lion. Because of the Nietzsche quotation.
Yes.
Laughing Lions.
Yes, and also, I mean, here he you know, the lion is holding this board saying "Getting old sucks."
Yes.
And the yellow, which it's not that well produced, but it says guaranteed collector friendly. So he was encouraging the potential collectors, which again is where his humor is coming through. Next one. One of his last paintings, Bite Your Tongue. He died in 2004. And over the last few years, he was diagnosed with a very slow moving developing form of cancer in the end of the 90s. And it meant that he found it hard to work on large paintings. I mean, he did 3 large paintings over those last 4-year period, but he switched scale and went back to drawing and went back to much smaller works and smaller paintings. So the next one. This is the series, This Could Be You.
And the Serpentine show was a very good, I thought, a very good representation of the drawings, which I didn't really know.
Yeah, and this is one series, This Could Be You. There's also We Can Disappear You. And Okwe Enwezor chose about 20 of these works that were in his documenta, which I think was in 2000 or 2001 too. But Golub was too ill to go to it, so he never actually saw the work there. But it meant that for the last 4 years of his life, he focused on smaller works. And the next work, which I think is the last one, these drawings, roughly A4 size, oil stick on vellum. And several hundred of these, he would do 2 or 3 in a day. I think very much of this is his late style.
I just want to say that, I mean, one of the reasons why I chose to end my main text in my book on 20th century figuration with Golub is that I happened to be in New York in the year 2000. And there was a sort of seminar or conference or whatever, and I found my big room sitting in on with lots of, I mean, there were critics, anyway, everyone had their say. And he came on right at the end. And he was a little tiny gnome by then. It looked a bit like the mighty Mekon, actually, because of the huge dome of his skull somehow. And at first he was rather boring in a way, because he was talking about the year 1900 in France, and he'd done some archival research about what they thought the 20th century was going to consist of. And of course, they all got it terribly wrong. And up till then, all the speakers had just assumed the future was digital, that basically art, the idea of hand was going to be lost completely. That really was a general preconception in the year 2000 of all the, you know, one person after another. And I suddenly realized that he changed his discourse. And I suddenly heard the words. He said, so my first metaphor for the contemporary painter is the cockroach. There's so many of them, they're always underground. They suddenly come up, you tread on them, you can't get rid of them. And my second metaphor is the sewer rat. So, and it was hilarious. Nobody laughed, nobody said anything, they didn't know what to do with him. And I thought it was a wonderful trope about you can't really get rid of painting. It's going to go on. Yes. And I think all these works have a quality of his resisting the idea that it was over.
Yeah.
I think that is an important part of what he offers.
I think it is. And I think they're always topical. I mean, every time I've done a Golub show, the audience, the visitors have said, this is so much about now. I mean, when the Abu Ghraib photographs first started appearing in the press,
Absolutely.
I mean, those images, you know, they could have come straight out of Golub's interrogation series.
And Trump.
Yes, yeah. I do wonder what he'd have done with Trump. I wonder what Golub would have made of Trump, actually.
Well, thank you very much, John.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful conversation and really wonderful journey through Golub's work and Spero's work, and right into their studios. Thank you for that. Sharing your memories too of their studios. It really brings it to life in a different way. So yeah, that was fantastic. We've got a few minutes for questions. If anyone would like to ask anything, put it in the chat, or you can speak directly. I was just really thinking about this shift from Paris to New York, and this how you're describing the sort of feeding off the great history paintings at the Louvre, and then the sort of meeting with abstract expressionism, but it was making me think more about their circle. Who was their sort of artistic circle, and was there a major shift? You mentioned sort of Guston and wondering about that, but I was just wondering who they were.
Well, and again, I benefited hugely from this. They were a focus for the whole range of artistic circles. I mean, that was what was right. I think they were held in very high esteem for their integrity, not just for their work, and even artists who did not necessarily respond to either, Leon's form of figuration or indeed Nancy's work, still respected the position that they represented in terms of not just their own practice, but their politics. So it wasn't just in terms of their practice. The studio at LaGuardia was a center for a whole series of political actions. I mean, when there was something called Artists' Call, which was artists, writers, intellectuals against American involvement in South America, it was Golub Spero studio, that was where they met. Same with over AIDS. They produced joint images, joint posters and things for various AIDS events. They did it, of course, over issues to do with civil liberties. I mean, they had an extraordinary presence. And also Nancy had an enormous circle of women artists and writers and curators. They were also extremely generous hosts. I mean, I on a number of occasions, I had students who said, well, we're going to New York, where might we see some Leon Golub paintings, or where might I look at a Nancy Spero? And I'd say, well, go to the studio. And they said, well, no, we can't do that. And what gallery should we go to? I said, no, I'll let them know, just turn up. And they come back to London and say, I spent the day there. It was incredible,
Night. It sounded like it was after the night.
They made us tea. Since they had the night for work.
Oh, yes, the night was right. Yeah.
A lot of artists would like that.
Yeah. And I wondered it was really fascinating hearing about the color, that the importance of color and the shifts in color, and I was so interesting to hear the sort of the Pompeii red and how that connection. And then there's the Paris, was it the Paris black or the Black Paris paintings of Spero? Yeah. And just, do you think that nighttime working, I mean, that must have affected obviously the light and the sort of.
I think it did, but I think it also took its toll on them. I mean, towards the last few years, Leon did fall back. Well, not fall back. He did adopt a more regular, sort of daytime, nighttime practice where he would go to bed late, but Nancy wouldn't. Right up until the end, she would continue, sort of being up, working, listening to the radio, pottering around, whatever. This was her pattern, and she wasn't going to break it. I think the other thing, I mean, unless people, had met Nancy or knew about her, is she had a stronger will and more courage than any other person, not just person I've ever known. I mean, she developed crippling arthritis in her mid-30s. So she had 50 years of being in pain, basically. I mean, she took an extraordinary range of pills to offset this. She had osteoporosis, her spine was crumbling. I mean, and yet she just carried on. It made her hangry, you know, it made her sort of irritated because he couldn't do work. But I mean, she just focused on work. And sometimes that could seem almost like a kind of selfishness, because the other thing was, of course, Nancy would always keep you waiting. And the number of times I've been there, you know, there's been me and there's been other people. And I remember with Kiki Smith being there, and we've been waiting for Nancy to kind of get ready. And this could take 2 or 3 hours. And eventually it got to the point where people would just take food round. They say, we can't go out to eat. We'll bring the food and we'll put it on the table. And eventually, you know, Nancy will eat it. And when she died, we did a commemoration at the Whitechapel Art Gallery with Ivana. And I remember one of the speakers said, you always wait for Nancy, but Nancy's always worth waiting for. And in a way, Leon always waited for Nancy. And he had extraordinary kind of patience and tolerance over this. But she had to devote everything to just keeping herself going to make the work.
Wonderful, thank you. It's so sort of invigorating to hear about the ways in which they supported and influenced and sort of mutually enriched each other's work. And I was really struck by the sort of weaving in of the text element and that dialogue. And actually there's someone who's just asking actually about the poetry. What book by Antonia Artaud would you recommend as a companion to Nancy Spero's work?
Well, Sontag. Do you think the Sontag?
Maybe, yes. I mean, she would just grab things, basically. I mean, you know, she read most of Artaud's poetry. So she had, she knew there was a guy called, it's called Clayton Eshelman, and he is one of the big Artaud experts. He has a journal in the States called Sulphur, which did a lot of the early translations of Artaud. So she was introduced to a lot of Artaud's work through Clayton Eshelman. But there is a number of, I try to think of any, there hasn't...
There are recordings of him performing, ranting, shouting. They're extraordinary. I'm sure they're online now.
Well, they're online, but also there was an exhibition at MoMA of Artaud's drawings, his extraordinary drawings and spell.
Yes,
and there was a beautiful catalogue produced in relationship to that. And there were 2 events. There was Derrida, who is also a big Artaud scholar and interpreter. Derrida gave a talk at MoMA in the grand hall at MoMA, where there must have been 500 people there. And this talk went on for something like 4.5 hours. And he did the kind of pronunciation of Artaud. And then the next day or 2 days later, he was on a panel with Nancy Spero, Sylvain Lotringer, Clayton Eshelman, a couple of others, talking about Artaud. And I think there may have been a publication or something that came out of that.
Just to say, I mean, earlier in the 30s, his daily companion, they met every day, was Balthus. So he has a big span, you see.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, lots of other questions coming in. I don't want to keep you too long, but just there's another about so from Ben Clark around he'd just seen a video of Spero doing a mural in Northern Ireland. Yes. He writes that they were so plugged in. It seems as if everything was they seem so plugged into everything that was going on politically. And the questions about were they linked to activists, or how far they were linked to activists, and was this sort of relationship with activism difficult for them, you know, in relation to the art world?
They had their, they had their kind of networks and connections. Nancy particularly, but that period in Ireland, they both showed, that was through Declan McGonigal, who was director of the Orchard Gallery. One of the most interesting, I think, museum directors. And when I first proposed the Spero exhibition, Declan was director of art at the ICA. He was there for 2 years and then went back to the Orchard. And he did an exhibition. He did both a Golub and a Spero exhibition. And the Spero exhibition, she did some murals. It was at the height of the Troubles. I mean, it was a very, very dangerous time in Derry, particularly. And Declan somehow managed with the Orchard Gallery to create not in sort of a neutral space, but a space that was left alone both by the Unionists and the Nationalists. It was sort of recognized that, you know, you didn't bomb the Orchard Gallery. But Nancy did some very provocative work, working with some of the Irish Republican women. She did some poetry where she did on the walls, and then did various other kind of installations, because she then developed a process whereby she could print onto these rubber plates, so they could actually print onto uneven surfaces on external walls as well as internal surfaces. And I remember being at the gallery when there was, after the exhibition, they had a talk. And it did become quite difficult, because there was an accusation of what is this American artist doing, coming over here, you know, representing or intervening in, you know, in our struggle. But she won them round. I mean, she just talked about her position as an excluded artist, as a woman artist in that situation. But they, yes, I mean, there was no separation from them between the various kinds of political engagements they had. So, you know, their politics took the form either with Nancy of, you know, of a scroll or of a painting, with Leon of a painting, but it also took the form of a print. It took the form of a talk. It took the form of a conversation over dinner. It took the form of the people they were, you know, constantly corresponding with. So it was really a kind of a lived politics.
Yeah, thank you. You brought that to life so well, and it seems to kind of the sort of parallel, I suppose, with the way in which they worked. You know, living in that domestic space, feeding into and sort of bleeding into the creative space, and the kind of social, communal, collective aspect of it all, with people dropping in and as you brought to life. I suppose a question following on from that we've had is around sort of asking about the thinking behind those portraits of the politicians and businessmen, and, you know, where they, I suppose, well, they're asking, were they done on commission? I suppose not. No.
Well, many of the people were dead, so that wouldn't. No, they weren't artists who ever responded that way. No, they were. I say they were done over a kind of 2-year period, although most of them were done in 76, in a sort of 6-month period, in fact, where he did about 80 of them. They were all from found images. So I say either from Reuters images or from magazines. And he worked very much, although there were individual ones, but he also worked very much in series. And he would actually have a series of depictions or heads over a number of years. So, for example, the Franco series represents a young Franco, a very kind of preening image in his military uniform, to Franco in a casket, a death mask. The same with Castro. He did it with Mao. He did it over Rockefeller over a series. And I say it wasn't about, it was about how the look of power is constructed and mediated in contemporary society. So he, in many respects, you know, they contradicted conventional portraiture norms, because I say he wasn't interested in the portrait as somehow telling some truth about the character. It was more, how do you tell a truth about how power is imaged within our society.
And he kind of avoided caricature in a way.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we're going to have to draw to a close, but there was one last question which I thought we should pose to you, which is where can you see their work in the UK? You know, what collections could we sort of develop this further?
John's got plenty.
We're visiting your studio.
Well, I do. I mean, yeah, they did give me work over the years. It's an important collection. It will eventually, I'm in negotiation. It's going to go to the Tate eventually. And we're talking about doing a show of the work in maybe 2 or 3 years' time. More immediately, in terms of Nancy Spero, her gallery in well, Golub's gallery is now represented by Hauser and Wirth,
Yeah.
and has been for the last 5 years, although they haven't shown him recently. But they do have Golub works at Hauser and Wirth in London. And if you go along there and say you're researching or working on Leon Golub, then I'm sure they would arrange for you to see them. Or if you have a problem, then let me know and I can arrange something. Nancy Spero is now represented in London by Frith Street Gallery, by Jane Hamlin. And we're talking there's going to be a big show this time next year of Nancy Spero at the Frith Street Gallery.
Fantastic. Well, lots to look forward to then. And thank you both so much again. It's been really fantastic. Thank you. Thanks to everyone listening also and asking questions.
All right.
Lots of messages of appreciation for you both that you've probably seen in the chat and Q&A. So thanks once again.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.